First of all, they had the advantage of time. This should be to us a very important perspective to take into account. The early church, or the primitive church within the first few hundred years, had an extreme advantage of time. It was Tertullian who said this. In his day, there were different gospels already going around. He said, "I say that my gospel is the true one. Marcion, who was a leading Gnostic teacher, he says that his is. I say that Marcion's gospel is adulterated. He says mine is." Now, how can we settle this standoff unless we use the principle of time? According to this principle, authority lies with the one who is prior in time. It's based on the elemental truth that corruption of doctrine lies with the one who is shown to have originated later in time. Since error is falsification of truth, truth must necessarily precede error. Does that make sense? Since error is the falsification of truth, there's got to be truth back before it, right? And so he's making a good point. In fact, this is the principle that all historians use for history and anything, is the further you can go back, the more authentic, the closer that you get to the actual event, the more authentic it's likely to be. It doesn't mean that it can still be wrong. I mean, an eyewitness could be wrong of a crime, and somebody 50 years later who was born and investigated it could figure it out. I mean, it is true. There's a possibility of that, but think about it. These people sat at the feet of the apostles. They got to ask questions we can never ask. Like, what did you mean by that? They got to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. And if we finally come to the conclusion that our doctrine is completely correct, because we will see that I've seen this, is that there are many of my doctrines that conflict with theirs. And when I ask myself the question, well, who's right? If I conclude that I'm right, what I'm saying is, within 50 years of the birth of the church, they totally messed up and missed it. And almost 2,000 years later, I figured it out. That's a pretty bold statement to say. I'm not saying it could be wrong, but they had a huge advantage of time. We go way back as far as we possibly can, find the most ancient New Testament manuscripts, and when we find them, we conclude, whatever came out of that, that's the one I want. What if somebody in the 1600s would have wrote the New Testament for the first time, based upon what people had said down through history, and they sat down and they go, I think I've got a pretty good grasp on what happened back then, and with no Bible, sat down and started writing a gospel. Jesus said this, and then he did this. And so you've got a text from the 1600s. How much more would you trust that compared to a text that you had from 50 years after Jesus spoke what he spoke? I mean, it's obvious you would say, okay, these people have a clearer perspective of what they meant by what they said. And so I would say it's important to study the doctrine and lifestyle of the primitive church, in that they have a huge advantage of time. I mean, the English language changes very subtly to the point where, I mean, your grandparents, or if you have great-grandparents, if they're still alive, their words are pretty much the same as ours. Maybe the slang is just a little bit different, but the actual words are the same. You could have a conversation. But go back to 13th century medieval English, and it's like reading a total different language. Even the King James is hard to understand. It comes from the 1600s. You can see how things down through time change. And so for us to say that the gospel and the truth of the word of God totally changed, and they had a totally bad perspective of it, and then all the way down through time we figured it out, is a pretty bold step. We better study those things through and make sure that we're right in that.